Please welcome Mike and Leon.
Morning, everyone. I'll try to keep to time. I know we've got lunch afterwards, so I'll try to get us out of time. So this is actually the third year that we've done the survey, and when we sort of looked at this, doing a survey for Australia was, we wanted to look at getting some good data relevant to our country, because there's a lot of other surveys that's done, but we tend to sort of focus more on the top end of town. So what we're going to present here is the results from last year's survey that we've done. We ran it from, I think it was September up till November. And we had about just over 500 responses coming back, which I think was actually quite a good response rate. And we sort of targeted organizations that's on the lower end. It's not sort of top end enterprises. So sort of below the $10 billion annual turnover for a corporate. A lot of responses from government entities, education sector. So what I want to talk through is, I think it's important to look at how the global risk landscape has changed. And there's sort of a bit of learnings that I want to take away from that, and there's a theme we've sort of carried into looking at the World Economic Forum, which is the analysis that we've taken there from a global perspective, and then say, what do we see in the survey results in the Australian threat landscape? And then we have seen a lot of increases in security spend, so what is the impacts that came from that? We've also seen some legislative changes, so the Mandatory Data Breach Notification came to effect last year, GDPR is in place, so how did that impact changes in behaviours coming through the survey? And then we'll just have some final thoughts at the end. So, as I mentioned, the World Economic Forum on an annual basis publish a report which talk about risks going to impact the global economy. And over the last number of years, we're seeing cybersecurity data breaches really going up over the years. And what we now see is, from an likelihood perspective, a cyber attack and data breaches is within the top 5 of likelihood. And if you look at what's sitting around that, is societal, environmental issues. So it's quite difficult to address those likelihood. So if cybersecurity is sitting there, are we losing the battle? So are we doing enough to actually reduce the likelihood? And if you look at some of the strategies that's put in place for some of those other risks, it's not about reducing the likelihood. I think it's just the impact that's been looked at. But actually, there's a lot of work being putting into how do you address the impact of the consequence for that. So just to start off, looking at where some of the cybersecurity insights came from. So what we have there is the trends over the last 3 years, and actually the trend line, or the line there, is what actually the respondents were saying they expected in the coming year. And to me, what is actually quite interesting is to see that I think we underestimate the effect of cyber criminals. When if you look at, there's a lot of that happening. I mean, over 60% still of attacks relate to cyber criminals. For me, the interesting part there is sort of the increase over time on third-party hosting providers, attacks happening there, or data breaches happening there. And if you look at the concerns going forward, there's an increased concern around that. So if you look at take a look at the incidents that was experienced. So what we've got there is, on the left-hand side of that graph, is showing what attacks actually took place last year. I put a line over there to say, the question we asked a year before that is to say, well, where was the expected attacks going to come from? And then on the right-hand side is, where do we expect attacks to come from in the future? And for me, the interesting one that keeps coming up is phishing. There wasn't a concern. If you look at how increase of that is coming through, I mean, it's almost double than what was expected to happen. And if you look at still looking in the future, where the expected attack's going to come from, that's still fairly low. What is interesting is the concern around data theft, data loss. I mean, that's really out of whack if you look at the right-hand side of where that's coming from. I don't know, Mike, if you've got some observations around what AusCERT has seen.
Absolutely, and I think we're very lucky that we sit in a privileged position where we can see across just about every industry sector in Australia. And funnily enough, the prevalence of incidents that we see that is the highest is still phishing. After all this time, phishing is still effective.
Just check your mic.
So that's all. I think I've got a dead battery. Sorry, can everyone hear me? Right. Let's try that not right in front of a speaker. So one interesting thing that we did see though was that ransomware actually tapered off a little bit this time. So we obviously were getting a lot of incidents coming through from our members saying ransomware, 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 and then it just seemed to taper off a little bit over the last probably 12 months or so. Interestingly though, there's still actually a lot of people thinking that that is something that they need to worry about, and that's a good thing. So our deduction from that was people have probably increased their controls. That was the only logical reason for it, because there's still ransomware out there. We still see a lot of malware that we're ripping apart and finding obviously is a ransomware variant of some kind. So I guess that the takeaway from this is to actually have processes and procedures in place to deal with those common incidents, and those of you that have done that, you've seen a drop off in those incidents.
Thanks, Mike. What are your thoughts around why there's a sort of also a difference between what is experienced from unauthorized external access? And if you look at the concerns a year ago raised, it's sort of the same magnitude if you're looking forward. We think we're concerned about who's got access to our systems. I mean, it's a stat that at this stage, we can't really explain why there's a difference there.
What's the difference? Sorry. Is it just overconfidence?
No, it's actually, well, we don't see as many, well, it's probably fear is what's coming through. So if you look at just data breaches specifically, we've seen a 79% increase from previous years around data breaches, and that's a concern that we hope is not going to carry into the future. If you look at the type of information that's typically breached, is contact information. And if you look at identity theft, is over a quarter of, sorry, over 25% of that actually can relate directly to identity theft. And financial information, what is quite interesting is that it's only 10% of the type of information that's breached. And again, I have to preface that we looked at a population that's not in the top sort of quartile of industry. Now, if you look at the impacts, and again, this is some interesting information that when I first looked at this that came through is we've seen a reduction in impacts around loss to access for less than a day, recovery exercise required. But there's an increase in notification. Yes, we expected that to be the case because in previous years it wasn't required to notify. And the last report cycle, mandatory data breach notification was actually in place. And then things like employee records. I mean, there's been an increase around that. Customer records. But I think the other one is brand and reputational damage. So I think we have, anyone from the media here in the room? I think we got an enemy in the media around how bad cyber is, and I think that's the brand and reputational damage part. So I think that's something that it comes back to how do you control that risk and the impact, or the likelihood of that going to be run with. It is actually what do you need to put in place to reduce the impact thereof. I don't know, Mike, any thoughts on what you've seen coming through and the responses you did?
Yes, one of the things that we've noticed when we're talking to our members at the moment is the increased awareness further up the stack. And that was actually, and by stack I mean management layers, so CISOs or CISOs, depending on which university you went to. And that I think was also reflected in the survey, that there is actually awareness up at that higher levels now. Now what that means is the higher levels of management are then pushing further down and saying, have you got an incident plan for this? Can we do a tabletop exercise on some of these things and actually try out some of the plans that you've got in place? So what we're seeing with our members is the ones that actually have a well-tried, tested incident response plan, and by well-tried and tested, incident response plan, I can probably count on the fingers of one hand the number of people that actually have all of those things ticked. Those are the ones that have the reduced impact. And maybe if they have a ransomware attack, it might only take them a couple of hours to recover. Those that don't have any of those three things ticked off, it'll be days, weeks, whatever.
Thanks, Mike. So now let's look at what's the impact on the increased security investments. So I think the first thing is what we're showing there is, and it is a bit of a busy slide, but I think we need to look at it in that way. What we have on there is basically specific security controls that we looked at, and how that sort of improved over time. And if you look at, on average, less than 50 to 60% of governance-related security controls has been matured and has been implemented. I know there's a lot of work currently being done in industry around getting the information security management systems in place to sort of help with that. For me, the interesting part also coming out of that is, if you look at, there's a concern around unauthorized access, external parties accessing the environment. If you look at the level of maturity around having cloud security standards, third-party security standards in place, doing third-party risk assessments, that's fairly low from a maturity perspective. And then this morning we had a discussion, a presentation around SI, so you could see how low that maturity level is there overall. So I think that's definitely a career progression for those of us going through our career. I mean, there's definitely a need for that. So I think overall we have seen an increase in the governance related to cybersecurity, but I think the visibility around the risk outside of the organization, in your cloud providers, in your third-party providers, that seems to be fairly low. Then looking at prevention, so that's more about the likelihood, and again, not all of those controls relate to prevention. But for me, the interesting thing there is antivirus, malware protection, content filtering to block out bad emails. That's of the most mature security controls that's implemented. But if you look at phishing, still coming through. So I think the investment in those security controls, I'm not sure if that's working, and I think the presentation this morning, I think that was sort of echoed as well, is there need to be a shift around stopping building high walls and start thinking about what you need to do once it's in the network. Mike, some thoughts on your side?
Yes, one of the biggest problems that we see is that implementing a technical control is difficult. If you have the maturity to implement something like antivirus, well, hey, everyone's got that level of maturity, we've got that down pat. If you've got the level of maturity to take, for example, something that comes out of a highly concentrated feed of indicators of compromise that says, here is a hash of a binary, now go forth and search for that in your environment, be it your content filters or your SIEM or whatever, to actually find out, did this come into your environment? Is it coming into your environment? Has it executed on your desktops? That sort of thing. That level of maturity we're seeing is very low. So it's almost a little bit depressing in that we have a bunch of really good information that we try to get out to our members, and I guess the uptake of it is not as quick as we've hoped for. So we've had to sort of adjust our thinking into, well, hang on, maybe we need to actually help our members implement some of these technical controls. That seems to be the difficulty. Similarly with cloud technologies now, every time someone looks at, email filtering in the cloud or web browsing, corporate web browsing system through the cloud, there's limited ways that you can actually use that to detect what's going on. You've got to trust their threat intelligence. So vendor XYZ will be doing their filtering with their antivirus, their whatever, and there's no way to input someone else's intelligence, like, for example, the ACSC or one of our feeds. So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to get all our lovely sponsor friends out here to understand that the government has threat intelligence, AusCERT's got threat intelligence, and just about anyone else might have it as well. And getting that into some of the technical controls that you're already able to use. That's the future, in my opinion.
So I think the interesting thing I mentioned before, if you look at the governance maturity levels, it's sort of sitting on the low end of 50. These controls are sort of around how do you reduce the likelihood of something happening. the maturity of that tend to be on the higher end, 70% side. So now, if you look at response, which is really about how do you reduce an impact when something has gone wrong. And if you look at that's about detection, so Security Operations Center capability is still fairly low. Having incident response plan in place has really improved over the years. And actually having an incident response standby capability to be able to respond to that. So really, I think there's probably where there need to be some investment going into is around reducing that impact. And I think if you think back of that slide that I showed right at the beginning around the World Economic Forum and look at the risk sitting there, cyber risk sitting there, it's really about how do you reduce the impact on a cyber incident. Okay, so from a regulatory changes perspective, so as I mentioned, mandatory data breach notification came to effect last year. For those of you who has got operations in Europe, GDPR is also a requirement. So what we actually looked at a year ago, we asked the question, what is the level of confidence for meeting that? And we actually seen quite a big step from the first time we looked at it until we actually ask it now again. So there's really been a good upliftment in the confidence level to meet those requirements, which means that organizations have really started investing in that. But that actually had some interesting trades. If you look at organizations that's required to comply, if you start looking at some of those controls again. So if you look at the impact that's going to have is the green bars there showing if organizations are required to comply to data breach notification, so it tend to be not a government organization or if you a small organization, the level of control maturity tend to be higher than when you're not required to comply with that. And to me, that's actually, it shows there's behavior, so there's a compliance requirement. There's a drive to actually start investing in become compliant. So I don't know if you've got any observations, if you've got any clients that you had to respond to that as part of a data breach notification.
We haven't had anything major recently, but what we have seen is everyone is now far more interested in, should I report this? And that little shift, instead of I need to stick it under the carpet, to am I required to report on this? That's been a really significant shift that's been obviously driven by that legislation.
Yeah, I mean, we've also recently helped a number of our clients to respond to incidents, and what is quite interesting is, I mean, we're not lawyers, so we can't give legal advice, but in our view, a number of those instances actually was required to report, and there's still the sort of an appetite not to go and talk to a lawyer and get advice because we'll be all right. So I think that's a concern going forward. And I think that sort of led into the other interesting stats that came through is similarly we ask around a data breach notification, specific areas that had to be put in place from a compliance perspective. So the first one is around putting a process in place to actually determine whether you need to notify. And the top graph there showing in the blue was at the time how confident organizations was at the time that they would comply with that. And then a year later, basically saying that confidence levels has gone up all the way. But to me, the interesting part still coming up is, yes, we've got a data breach notification plan, but has that been tested? I mean, I've been fortunate enough sitting in a number of operational roles in a SOC, and what you tend to do if there's a crisis, you don't go look at your plan, you just do it as you've always done. So I think that's the important part of having a plan in place. And I think that's, I mean, if you've got some thoughts on some of the training you're doing currently around that.
Yes, what we're actually doing, we've done this for the Victorian government in particular. They look to us for how do I actually write an incident plan? And the question evolved from, can I just have a template that I can fill in? The question then evolved after we sort of led them through what they're actually asking there. It led to, well, hang on, no, we'll actually come on site and we'll do a day with you and we'll train you in what that actually means. Because there's no such thing as a template that you just start from and go, right, there's your incident plan, done, you have to understand obviously the concepts behind it and then translate that into your own organisation. So that particular piece of training was actually at the request of Victorian Government at the time, and we've realised the value of it, and we're about to make that available to all our members to bring our expertise in terms of, well, this is what we think you should do, using the NIST guidelines. Obviously, we don't just make this stuff up, in order to actually come up with a plan.
Thanks. So just some final thoughts on the survey itself. So if you look at, again, coming back to the point, bringing it back to reducing the impact. So what we did there was actually look at organisations that put some effort into planning and preparation. What was the impact that if there was a data breach or a cybersecurity incident, how better prepared they were than those that actually did not have that in place. And data recovery is the big one there, is that it's almost 3.5% or 3.5 times more prepared to actually respond to an incident because if they've done a preparation work, so they know where the confidential information is sitting, they had a register of that, they exercise it, so least likely that that's going to impact them. Access to systems and information, so it's losing that. Again, that just shows that it's worth to start actually putting some effort into preparing for an incident, understanding where your critical information is, know who your service providers are, know who to contact, because it's quite often there's data breach plan in place, but you're relying on a third-party system. You know the vendor is, but this is after hours. Who do you contact? So contact information of a third-party provider is not in the plans. Any final thoughts from your side, Mike?
Yes, actually, that for those that are AusCERT members, one of the biggest problems we have is we don't publish our contact number on our website because it's members only. So you've got to log in to the website. So one of the biggest problems we've found, and I think this is common across a lot of security suppliers, is the proverbial hits the overhead rotary cooling device, and then everyone sort of dives straight for the phone book and they don't have the right numbers to call. So one of the things we say to everyone is just grab our incident hotline number. It's a 1-800 number. You can put it in your phone, and make sure you've done the same for all of your other suppliers, like Leon just said. That's probably if you take nothing else out of this, just be prepared with those phone numbers.
Okay, I think that's the end of our formal presentation. If there's any questions, feel free to shoot.
We've got 15 minutes.
Cheers, Mike. In slide 16, there was a really interesting view of the difference between the combination of already implemented in 2017 coupled with planning to implement in the next 12 months compared with actual implementation. So I find this data really interesting because for many of the other categories, my initial thoughts are, what did people say last year? What was their intention to adopt compared with actual adoption? This one's really interesting because we can see for the most part, people did do what they said they were going to do in relation to NDB preparation. But do you guys have a feel for that comparison between intention and adoption for other controls as well?
Yeah, so I mean that's an example. We'll probably look at that one. We have graphs like that shows similarly already adopted, plan to be adopted, and don't know. So we have those statistics for the last 3 years. And that's why we put those trend lines, and those are more, the trend lines there are already adopted. I think with last year's presentation, I actually did show where the plan adoption was and how does it compare with the actual. But if you're interested, we can share that information with you.
Okay, any other questions?
In that case,
Sorry.
don't touch the button. In that case, everyone could thank Leon and Mike. That'd be great. And
Thank you.